Dakota Territory, 13th of January, 1888. By 5 in the morning, the temperature at many Army and Signal Service posts across the northern plains had fallen below -20 degrees Fahrenheit. In parts of Dakota and Montana, readings dropped toward -40 degrees as the cold front that produced the Schoolchildren's blizzard pushed Arctic air south over open range and ranch country. On most outfits, the pattern was the same: a long frame or log barn, a small cast-iron stove glowing in the center aisle, frost on every nail head, and stall floors where shallow water froze solid within minutes. Ranches that kept careful books recorded winter fuel use, climbing to several cords of wood, even as farriers and veterinarians noted stiff, coughing horses at the end of every hard season. At the same time, other frontier buildings, masonry stoves in immigrant homes, adobe and sod walls, earth-bermed lodges, quietly showed that heavy material at the right height could store heat for hours after a fire went out. This documentary follows one specific adaptation of that principle into the barn, a low ring of stone around a stove, what ranch hands later called a heat halo, and how it changed both wood piles and hoof-level cold. Frost rime coated the barn rafters and stall partitions, while a single red-hot stovepipe hummed in the center aisle. The date was 13th of January, 1888. Sample weather posts scattered from the Yellowstone Valley across central Dakota Territory into northern Nebraska recorded air temperatures plunging through the pre-dawn hours. At Fort Assiniboine in Montana Territory, observers noted -38 degrees Fahrenheit. At Valentine in northern Nebraska, -26 degrees. At Huron in Dakota Territory, -32 degrees with northwest winds near 30 miles per hour. These were not exceptional readings for the northern Great Plains in midwinter. The previous 2 winters had delivered similar cold. The winter of 1886 to 1887, remembered as the Great Die-Up, had combined deep cold, heavy snow, and sustained wind to kill an estimated 40 to 90% of open-range cattle across Montana, Wyoming, and Dakota Territory. That catastrophe had forced ranchers to abandon free-range practices and shift toward fenced pastures, hay storage, and sheltered wintering. By 1888, most outfits maintained barns or sheds for high-value animals: saddle horses, remuda stock, broodmares, and foals. A typical northern plains horse barn measured 60 to 100 feet long, 14 to 18 feet high at the ridge, with single board or log walls and minimal insulation beyond wind tightness. The long axis often ran east to west to catch prevailing winds on the gable, but large doors at each end leaked air. Inside, stalls lined both sides of a central aisle. Hay storage occupied overhead lofts. A single small stove in the center. Aisle provided supplemental heat during deep cold. The assumption behind this design was straightforward. A roof, 4 walls, and a stove were sufficient protection for working horses and foals in any winter. The outcome, documented in weather tables and stock reports, told a different story. Air temperature at hoof level sat only a few degrees above outside temperature, despite a red-hot stove burning in the same enclosed space. Army and Signal Service observers recorded air temperature, wind speed, and barometric changes at posts across the region. Ranchers and county stock growers reported winter losses and described shelter conditions in agricultural reports. A veterinary surgeon attached to a territorial agricultural college noted stabled horses with cold-related stiffness, animals that were technically sheltered but still suffering from inadequate floor-level warmth. The typical ranch inventory included 40 to 80 saddle horses and remuda animals. Foals and broodmares were brought into barns or sheds during deep cold. Yet even with shelter and supplemental heat, routine winter lows below -20 degrees Fahrenheit created conditions where effective wind chill likely fell below -50 degrees during blizzard events. Inside the barn, the stove created a warm bubble near its immediate vicinity. But most of the added energy collected at the ceiling while floor-level cold continued to load animals with stress. Weather tables from January 1888 and other 1880s winters show this pattern clearly. State and territorial stock reports reference winter losses and the move toward barns and sheds after the Great Die-Up. The records that show ranches heating barns also show animals crippled by cold floors and deep losses in bad winters. Heat was present, just not where it was needed. A small cast-iron stove perched on a thin scrap of iron over tamped earth and manure. 30 feet away, a metal bucket surface had skinned over with ice. The scene was typical of winters from 1870 through 1890 in representative barns near small rail towns and river crossings in Dakota Territory and Montana. The assumption was that any stove was better than no stove, and that more wood meant more comfort. The outcome was different. Comfort was limited to a narrow zone immediately around the heater. Beyond that radius, surfaces and air remained near freezing, and floors stayed hard as stone. A ranch hand on the winter feeding crew described how workers crowded toward the stove between chores, warming their faces and fronts while their backs stayed cold. A farm bulletin writer warned that warm heads and cold feet were worst-case conditions for stock, that animals needed moderate, even temperatures rather than extreme gradients. Stove manufacturers advertised small barn stoves in equipment catalogs, emphasizing quick response and compact footprint. The stoves themselves were typically small sheet iron or cast iron heaters 18 to 24 inches in diameter, designed for quick response rather than heat storage. Fuel consisted of cut cottonwood or pine, sometimes coal near railheads. Operators fed wood in armloads every hour or two to maintain heat. Floors were open plank or puncheon in some barns, tamped earth in others, often overlaid with 4 to 8 inches of manure by late winter. The heating pattern was predictable. Hot air rose along the stovepipe and spread under the roof. Cold air pooled in stalls and along outer walls. Temperature stratification was severe. Measurements taken at 3 heights showed a consistent pattern. Rafters might sit at 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, while hoof level stayed at 5 to 10 degrees above zero. The fuel was heating the roof more than the horses. Period farm bulletins and later stable ventilation texts described standard barn stove practices and noted temperature stratification as a chronic problem. Equipment catalog plates showed recommended stove sizes and clearances, but these specifications focused on fire safety rather than thermal efficiency. The thin-walled stoves radiated strongly, but mostly drove convective currents upward. Without thermal mass at floor level, heat left quickly, and the barn reverted to outside conditions at hoof height between firings. The physical principle was straightforward. Light air rises, dense cold air sinks. A single-point heat source in the middle of a large, minimally insulated space creates vertical circulation that moves warmth upward and away from the floor. Animals standing on cold floors lost body heat through their hooves and legs. Their lungs drew cold air from the stall level, not the warmer air circulating near the ceiling. The stove was working, but its energy was being delivered to the wrong part of the barn. A ranch ledger page showed 3 entries across January. Wood, barn, 2 cords. Wood, barn, 2 cords. Wood, barn, 2 cords. Alongside these appeared entries for feed grain, farrier services, and a note reading, "Colt lost after storm." The date range covered the typical deep cold season, December through March, in the 1880s. The location was a cattle and horse outfit 20 to 40 miles from a timber source. The assumption was that fuel was merely another winter input, expensive but manageable. The outcome revealed that the true cost of poor barn design was paid twice, once in wood and labor, once in animal health and survival. A bookkeeper at a ranch near the Yellowstone Forks noted rising wood purchases across successive winters. A rural blacksmith recorded shoeing horses that came in stiff and footsore from standing on ice. A veterinarian noted respiratory issues and chilled colts in annual reports. The logistics of wood supply were substantial. Teams traveled 10 to 20 miles to timber. 1 cord equaled 128 cubic feet of stacked wood and required 1 to 2 days of combined work. To fell, buck, haul, and stack per cord. Wood use in a large barn that ran a stove most days during deep cold typically reached 4 to 8 cords per winter. The opportunity cost was significant. Time cutting wood was time not spent on fencing, feed hauling, or equipment repair. Ranch operations ran on tight schedules. Every day a crew spent in the timber was a day they were not maintaining infrastructure or tending stock. The health impacts were equally measurable. Cold floors led to hoof ice, slips, and strains. Cold air at nostril height increased susceptibility to coughs and pneumonia in foals. County histories and memoirs described winter wood hauling as one of the most labor-intensive seasonal tasks. Early veterinary texts linked housing conditions directly to equine health, noting that inadequate shelter contributed to higher mortality and reduced performance. A design that wasted heat overhead forced constant fuel input. High fuel demand pulled labor off other critical tasks while still failing to prevent cold-related injury and illness. The arithmetic was unforgiving. Some outfits burned as much wood on one barn as on all their living quarters, and still entered spring with weaker horses and smaller foal crops. The ledger lines told the story in plain numbers. Wood purchases climbed, veterinary charges accumulated, foal crops dropped. The barn had a stove and the stove was burning, but the system was failing at its primary task, keeping animals healthy through the winter. A cross-section of a sod house wall revealed 24 to 36 inches of packed earth and roots. A small fire had burned out hours earlier, yet the interior remained above freezing until morning. The scene was typical of Scandinavian and German homesteads in Minnesota and Dakota, sod districts in Nebraska and Kansas, and indigenous earth lodge regions along major plains rivers from 1870 through 1890. The assumption prevalent among many stockmen was that thin board walls and quick stoves were enough, and that barns did not need house-level construction. The outcome visible in dwellings showed otherwise. Heavy walls and masonry heaters demonstrated that mass could carry heat across long, cold nights with minimal fuel. A Norwegian homesteader noted in a diary that the brick stove, fired twice, keeps the room warm until dawn. A German farmer described tile stoves and the comfort of sitting against a warm masonry wall. Indigenous lodge builders relied on earth and timber shells that buffered temperature swings far better than thin-walled frame construction. Sod and adobe houses on the plains commonly featured walls 18 to 36 inches thick. These structures often had a single small stove, yet the interior remained habitable on minimal fuel. The wall thickness provided high thermal mass, not just insulation. During the day, the mass absorbed heat. At night, it released that heat slowly, maintaining interior temperature. Masonry and tile heaters used by Scandinavian and German immigrants followed a similar principle. These structures weighed several tons and incorporated multiple flues that extracted maximum heat from combustion gases. Operators fired them once or twice daily. The heated masonry then emitted steady, radiant heat for 18 to 24 hours. Earth lodges, timber frames covered with willow, grass, and 2 to 3 feet of earth, showed interior temperatures markedly more stable than outside conditions. Ethnographic studies documented these structures along the Missouri and other major river systems. The design principles were ancient, refined over generations. Experience with high-mass dwellings demonstrated a general principle. Heavy material close to living bodies buffered temperature extremes far better than air and thin wood alone. Yet the same settlers who relied on 3-foot-thick earth walls to sleep through -30-degree nights were parking high-value horses behind 1-inch planks and a glowing iron box. The disconnect was striking. A black and white photograph from around 1900 showed a carriage house interior. The image revealed a brick floor, a broad hearth around a stove, and tools and harness hanging within reach of evident radiant warmth. The photograph was typical of evidence from 1880 through 1910 in plains and Midwestern barns and shops where masonry appeared under and around heaters. The assumed reason for stone under and around stoves was fire safety. Photographs and descriptions, however, showed pads made wider and thicker than necessary purely as spark guards, hinting at a secondary function as heat storage. Typical non-combustible clearances from stoves in late 19th century guidance specified 18 inches to walls and non-combustible hearths under and in front of stove doors. Dimensions of observed stove pads in surviving barns and carriage houses often measured 4 to 6 feet across, with several courses of brick or stacked stone deep. far beyond minimum code requirements. Historic building surveys and preservation briefs noted masonry hearths and raised platforms under stoves in service buildings, not just houses. These features appeared consistently across different regions and building types. The pattern suggested deliberate practice rather than random variation. The physical reality was straightforward. Even when the stated purpose was fire safety, any mass of stone or brick adjacent to a stove absorbed radiant heat and moderated floor temperatures. The masonry created a primitive heat halo effect whether builders intended it or not. A blacksmith familiar with forge work understood this principle intuitively. Anvils and stone floors near a forge held warmth long after the fire banked. A ranch hand who had seen masonry pads in carriage houses near the rail depot recognized the same pattern. A farm builder, referencing masonry footings in a manual, could adapt the technique to barn construction. The visual record showed stone and brick creeping outward from stoves, wider than fire code required, but exactly where cold was deepest. The evidence suggested that practical builders were discovering through experience what thermal engineering would later formalize. That concentrated mass near a heat source extends the duration and reach of warmth, particularly at floor level, where it matters most for animals and workers alike. Chalk lines traced on a barn's tamped earth floor marked a circle around the stove. Fieldstones piled nearby on a sled. The scene represented constructive reconstruction centered on 1880s through 1890s Northern Plains ranch barns during a late autumn before deep snow arrived. The assumption among frontier builders was that mass belonged in walls and chimneys. Floors stayed light for drainage and cleaning. The outcome of relocating mass challenged this convention. A small shift, concentrating stone in a low ring around the stove, targeted the coldest zone with stored heat. The proposed geometry was specific: stove body at center. Inner radius of clear space 30 to 36 inches, providing room for stoking and cleaning. Curb 16 to 24 inches wide, 6 to 10 inches high. Materials consisted of fieldstone or broken brick for the ring, with sand, cinders, or small gravel as infill. Builders could use lime mortar for joints or rely on tight, packed stone-to-stone contact. The physical principle was straightforward. Radiant energy from the stove was absorbed by stone. Stone re-radiated at hoof height over several hours, smoothing peaks and valleys in temperature. The system acted as a thermal battery, charged during active firing and discharged slowly between burns. Period masonry guides on hearth and foundation design showed similar trench depths and stone-laying practice. Historic photographs of service buildings included wide brick or stone pads under stoves, confirming that the technique was within the capability of ordinary ranch labor. By extending the non-combustible zone and raising it into a curb, a builder achieved two goals. Fire risk was mitigated. Sparks and embers landed on stone rather than combustible floor material. More importantly, the area of greatest cold stress was converted into a controlled radiant surface. On a plan, the heat halo looked like excess hearth, overly cautious fire protection. In practice, it shifted the barn's thermal center of gravity from the rafters down to the floor. The same fire that had been heating empty air now had a thermal mass to interact with, one positioned exactly where horses stood and breathed. A sled stacked with rounded granite stones and brick scraps pulled into the barnyard. Inside, the stove stood cold while chalk lines traced a ring on the packed floor. The date was late autumn, 1880s. The location was a working ranch barn 15 to 30 miles from a rail town, with fieldstone available in nearby coulees. The assumption was that any masonry project inside a barn would be too labor-heavy and disruptive to be practical. The outcome proved otherwise. A single day or two of off-season work with hand tools produced a permanent change in barn behavior. 2 ranch hands on off-duty rotation were assigned to stonework rather than fence repair. A local mason was consulted informally for trench depth and simple mortar mix proportions. A storekeeper noted small purchases of lime and sand in his account book. The tools required were basic: spades, shovels, picks, sledgehammer, cold chisel, hand tamper, carpenter's level, measuring cord. The build sequence followed straightforward steps. Workers moved the stove temporarily and marked the ring and stepped through gaps using cord and stakes. They dug a 4 to 6 inch deep trench, following the ring, and compacted the base with a tamper. The first stone course was laid with attention to level and tight fit. Workers adjusted stones by hand, checking every 2 to 3 feet with a carpenter's level. They packed joints with clay sand mix or lime mortar to eliminate air channels. A second course was added, bringing the curb to its final height of 6 to 10 inches. Interior space was filled with compacted sand or cinder to near the top of the curb. Finally, the stove was replaced on the new central pad and clearances were verified. Labor estimate for 2 workers was 8 to 12 hours of combined digging and stone setting. Farm building texts specified recommended hearth thickness, non-combustible clearances, and stone foundation practice, confirming that the work was within normal ranch capabilities. A modest one-time labor investment converted a high-maintenance heating pattern into a lower-maintenance, more stable system with benefits recurring every winter. Stone moved once in October made every hour of wood burned in January do double duty, heating both air and mass. 3 slim stakes driven into the aisle, each pencil marked at ankle, knee, and chest height. A glass thermometer tied at hoof level on the stake nearest the stove. The scene represented midwinter 1880s in the same barn during calm night test runs at -20 degrees Fahrenheit outside temperature. The assumption was that the ring would feel warmer but would not materially change measurable conditions. The outcome showed clear, repeatable gains at hoof height and reduced vertical stratification. A ranch manager interested in feed efficiency and veterinary costs conducted the measurements. A visiting agricultural agent or neighbor compared notes. The test protocol was simple. Outside air held steady at -20 degrees. Workers fired the stove strongly for 90 minutes, recording charge temperatures. They reduced the draft and read temperatures again at 1, 2, 4, and 6 hours. The baseline measurements, taken before the halo was built, showed the familiar pattern. 8 to 10 feet from the stove, hoof level measured roughly 10 degrees Fahrenheit, chest height measured roughly 35 degrees, and rafters measured 45 to 50 degrees. The gradient was extreme. After the halo was built, measurements changed. Just inside the stone ring, hoof level measured 28 to 30 degrees, chest height measured 40 to 42 degrees, and rafters measured 45 to 48 degrees. Mid-barn measurements showed hoof level temperatures 5 to 10 degrees higher than before. The condensation line on walls rose, indicating warmer lower air. Observed effects were immediate and practical. Hoof ice melted back from the ring. Manure near the halo remained friable instead of glassy hard. Tack hung near the halo felt usable by bare hand when tools near the outer wall remained painful to touch. Later, stable environment studies would confirm that thermal mass reduced vertical temperature gradients and cold stress indicators. The principle was consistent. A low stone mass around the stove pulled the temperature profile downward, bringing usable warmth closer to the animal's lungs and hooves without increasing ceiling temperature. On a temperature chart, the before lines peaked at the rafters. After the halo, the graph flattened and rose at the floor. The same fire, but a different barn. Numbers taken at hoof height showed a 10 to 15 degree Fahrenheit gain where lungs and hooves lived, achieved without raising ceiling temperatures at all. 2 facing ledger pages. The left page labeled Barn Wood, 1886 to 1887. The right page labeled Barn Wood, 1887 to 1888. The later years showed shorter tallies and fewer farrier and veterinary charges. The scene represented one representative deep cold season, a ranch comparing 2 winters' records, one before and one after the halo. The assumption was that any reduction in fuel use would come at the cost of colder barns and higher animal losses. The outcome proved otherwise. The halo allowed shorter, hotter burns that stored enough heat to maintain or improve animal comfort while reducing cord consumption. The ranch bookkeeper noticed wood outlays drop by 1 to 2 cords over the season. A farrier reported fewer chipped hooves and strains from slipping on ice. A local veterinarian noted fewer respiratory cases in foals from this barn compared to others. Before the halo, a 10-week deep cold stretch consumed roughly 1/2 cord of wood per week, totaling approximately 5 cords. After the halo, operators adapted their firing pattern to 2 strong daily burns with less idling of the stove. Wood use dropped to roughly 1/3 to 2/5 cord per week, totaling 3.3 to 4 cords. The labor and cost savings were tangible. 1 to 2 cords of wood were not cut, hauled, or paid for. Time saved became available for feeding, equipment repair, or extra hay hauling. Ranch operations ran more smoothly when crews were not constantly pulled off other tasks to service the stove. Health outcomes improved. Fewer lame horses resulted from icy floors near the stove. Higher foal survival and fewer cases of chilled animals appeared in barn records. Agricultural and veterinary bulletins linked improved stable conditions with reduced illness and better performance, confirming the pattern observed in practice. Thermal mass at hoof level turned intermittent fire into steady floor warmth, enabling lower total burn time for equal or better stock condition. Ledger math suggested a simple trade. 1 ring of stone around a stove saved the fuel equivalent of an extra wood hauling trip every year, and the horses that once pulled those loads now stood warmer because of it. A barn door rimmed with snow forced under the sill by wind. The stove had been banked low because wood runs were too dangerous until daylight. The date was 12 through 18 of January, 1888. The location spanned the northern plains ranching belt from the Missouri westward. The assumption in an extreme event was that all interior spaces would eventually equalize toward outside conditions, and that design details would not matter. The outcome showed otherwise. Temperature retention at hoof level in barns with stored heat differed significantly from those relying on convection alone. A railroad telegrapher relayed storm warnings and reported drifts blocking lines. Ranch crews decided whether they could risk hauling wood or must make do with what was stacked. Regional newspapers reported livestock deaths and stranded freights. Weather progression followed a familiar pattern: sharp temperature drop, high winds, whiteout conditions. In some regions, temperatures fell from near freezing to well below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. North Dakota points reported around -40 degrees with winds near 30 miles per hour. Constraints were severe. Wood stacks were trapped behind drifts or too exposed to reach. Limited burns were possible per day. Comparison between barn types was instructive. In a conventional barn, each firing yielded short-lived comfort. Floors reverted to near ambient temperature quickly. In a halo barn, floor-level stone retained heat for hours, holding hoof-level temperatures in the teens or low 20s despite limited burns. Weather and newspaper accounts from January 1888 detailed the speed and severity of the cold wave. The Schoolchildren's blizzard killed more than 200 people, many of them children caught in the open between school and home. Livestock losses were substantial in areas without adequate shelter. When weather limited fuel supply and firing frequency, the ability to store heat in mass became the decisive factor, not the peak brightness of the fire. On 2 ranches hit by the same storm, one recorded water still usable in buckets near the stove at dawn. The other chipped ice from pans in front of shivering horses. The difference was stone, a farrier's traveling kit beside a barn door. He had worked through 3 outfits this week and had a clear sense of which barns held warmth better. The scene represented post-storm review, late winter 1888, in a cluster of ranches within one weather region. The assumption was that heated barns performed roughly the same under stress and that differences were anecdotal. The outcome showed otherwise. Structural differences in how and where heat was stored showed up clearly in animal condition and incident rates. A farrier compared hoof condition and strain injuries across multiple ranches. A veterinarian tracked respiratory cases by barn. A county agent or stock association secretary collected incident notes for later reporting. Variables held roughly constant across the comparison included region, storm exposure, animal types, and feed quality. Differences centered on presence or absence of stone curbs or pads around stoves, floor type and drainage, and firing patterns. Metrics examined included number of animals slipping near stoves, days of productive work lost to lameness or illness, and wood consumed over the week. Results were consistent. Barns with thermal mass showed fewer injury incidents and somewhat lower wood usage for comparable or better conditions. The pattern aligned with emerging farm extension practice of comparing different husbandry methods through simple record-keeping and field observation. Agricultural colleges and experiment stations were beginning to formalize these comparisons, though most knowledge still spread informally through practical demonstration. Side-by-side comparison in one region turned isolated anecdote into pattern. Mass at hoof level consistently correlated with better outcomes under severe weather stress. The correlation was clear enough that neighboring ranchers began asking questions about construction details. What looked like a minor masonry detail inside the barn showed up later as fewer vet charges and more sound animals at branding time. The economic advantage was modest but real. In a business where margins were thin and losses from a single bad winter could end an operation, even small improvements in winter survival mattered. The farrier's notes, kept informally in a pocket ledger, documented the pattern. Barns with stone, fewer problems. Barns without, more work for him. A black and white photo of a carriage house interior from around 1900 showed a brick floor, a broad hearth around a stove, and tools and harness hanging within reach of evident radiant warmth. The scene represented 1890 through 1910 in regional farm bulletins, construction guides, and photographs. The assumption was that the heat halo was an oddity, if it existed at all. The outcome visible in documentation proved otherwise. Farm bulletins, stable ventilation manuals, and building surveys quietly confirmed a broader move toward masonry near stoves. Agricultural engineers wrote on stable ventilation and non-combustible construction. Rural builders incorporated expanded hearths and low walls into new barns. Photographers documented service buildings for insurance or preservation, capturing masonry details in the background of their images. Guidance from early 20th century sources emphasized non-combustible zones under and around heaters. Recommendations appeared for brick or concrete floors in high traffic, wet, or heated zones. Visual evidence showed wide masonry pads beyond minimal spark guard dimensions. Low curbs and half walls around heating equipment appeared in barns and shops across different regions. Veterinary advice from the period emphasized dry, moderately warm floors to prevent hoof issues and respiratory stress. Franklin H. King's 1908 treatise on ventilation for dwellings, rural schools, and stables addressed the need to control temperature and moisture while removing gases and preventing drafts. The text showed that scientific attention to barn microclimate was emerging as a formal discipline. Field observations from the 1880s and 1890s hardened into published recommendations, which in turn shaped the next generation of barns, carriage houses, and shops. The phrase heat halo never appeared in the manuals, but the diagrams showed it, brick and stone, drawn again and again around the stove. The documentation confirmed what practical builders had discovered through experience, that concentrating thermal mass at floor level near a heat source improved comfort, reduced fuel use, and lowered cold-related injury and illness. A modern wood stove in a metal shop standing on a poured concrete pad that extended well beyond code minimums. Boots were always parked on the warm concrete after a fire. The scene represented early 20th century to present in surviving barns on the northern plains and small modern shops in similar climates. The assumption was that radiant slabs and high-mass heaters were modern innovations. The outcome showed otherwise. The same principles were applied with stone, brick, and packed earth generations earlier in barns and outbuildings. A modern builder installing a masonry heater or radiant slab followed thermal engineering that would have been recognizable to an 1880s ranch hand. A preservation architect documenting old barns with stone pads and low curbs saw the same technique frozen in time. Early concrete barn floors included thicker pads under and around heaters. U-shaped and L-shaped curbs appeared around heating zones to keep bedding away and retain mass. Contemporary masonry heaters and radiant slabs used detailed engineering but obeyed the same core principle: store heat where occupants are. Preservation surveys and modern heater literature documented the continuity. Techniques first applied by frontier necessity survived, stripped of story, as standard engineering details in structures that still face the same cold. Modern masonry heaters fired once daily could maintain interior temperatures for 18 to 24 hours through radiant emission from heated stone or brick. The physics were identical to the frontier heat halo. Concentrate mass near the heat source. Let that mass absorb and slowly release thermal energy at the level where people and animals occupy space. What began as a way to stretch a woodpile on the open range now appeared as a line item in energy-efficient design specifications. The principle had never changed, only the materials and precision of execution. A composite image, a winter temperature chart with -30 Fahrenheit lows, beside a ledger entry reading barn wood, 3 cords, this season, where earlier pages showed 5. The scene synthesized the Northern Plains Ranch region, 1880s climate and cost conditions, viewed from the present. The assumption embedded in frontier mythology was that survival hinged mainly on toughness and luck. The outcome visible in the arithmetic of climate, fuel, and design showed that small, deliberate changes in how buildings stored heat often mattered more than bravado. Historians and builders reading the same old ledgers, weather tables, and foundation stones found linked patterns. The climate delivered repeated winters with -20 to -40 Fahrenheit lows. The economics demanded careful management of wood, labor, and animals' value against the cost of losses. The design solution was adding a low stone curb around an existing stove to change the barn's thermal behavior. Historical summaries noted that after severe winters like the Great Die-Up of 1886 to 1887, ranching became more a business, less a gamble, with greater investment in shelter and feed. The shift was documented in territorial and state agricultural reports, in insurance records showing improved infrastructure, and in photographs showing more substantial ranch buildings. When winters forced ranchers to think in terms of numbers instead of habit, those who treated barns as thermal systems, not just roofed enclosures, left more animals, more capital, and more structures standing. The heat halo was one example among many of practical adaptation, a technique that required no advanced engineering, no expensive materials, no specialized tools, only observation, modest labor, and willingness to relocate mass to where it was needed most. In the end, the proof was not in stories, but in numbers. Fewer cords burned, fewer animals lost, and stone still circling stoves and barns that have outlived everyone who first laid them. The climate tables, the masonry pads still visible in old barns, and the reduced fuel entries in a few surviving ledgers all point to the same conclusion. On the northern plains, engineered shelter quietly beat bravado, and a low ring of stone around a stove was one of the smallest, clearest proofs.